Hello, my name is Frank Dalton, and I need to tell you a story that still haunts my dreams 3 years later. It's a story about betrayal so deep, so calculated, that it changed everything I thought I knew about family, love, and the length someone will go to for revenge. Please sit down and listen to what I'm about to share with you, because this isn't just my story. It's a warning about how the people closest to us can sometimes become our greatest threat. And if you find yourself moved by what I'm about to tell you, please subscribe to this channel, because there are so many more stories like mine that need to be heard. Stories that remind us we're never truly alone in our pain. I want you to imagine this. You're 68 years old, living alone in a house that once echoed with laughter and family dinners, and you haven't spoken to your only son in 3 years. That was my reality on March 15th, 2021, my birthday. I'd grown accustomed to the silence, to celebrating another year of life with just my neighbor's cat for company and a store-bought cake that tasted like cardboard and regret. My son Ethan and I had what you might call a complicated relationship. After his mother, my beloved wife Sarah, passed away from cancer 6 years ago, something in Ethan broke, or maybe something in both of us broke. Sarah had been our glue, our translator when we couldn't understand each other's language of grief. Without her, Ethan and I became like two ships passing in the night, both mourning the same woman but in completely different ways. The final straw came 3 years ago during what should have been a simple family dinner. Ethan had married this wonderful girl, Lisa, and her father, Robert Carson, had become like a brother to me. Robert and I would spend hours talking about everything from baseball to philosophy, and he filled some of the empty spaces that Sarah's death had left behind. But Ethan saw our friendship as a betrayal somehow, as if I was replacing him with another man's son. That night, Ethan exploded. He accused me of caring more about Robert than my own flesh and blood. He said I'd chosen my new best friend over my son, and that I was nothing but a bitter old man living in the past. The words he used, well, some things can't be taken back. He stormed out, Lisa crying behind him, and Robert trying to mediate a situation that had spiraled beyond repair. That was the last time I saw my son's face without bars between us, so you can imagine my shock when, on my 68th birthday, a delivery truck pulled up to my house. The driver handed me a beautifully wrapped package with my name, written in Ethan's familiar handwriting. My hands actually trembled as I opened it. Inside was a bottle of Jameson Irish whiskey. The good stuff. Probably cost him $200. There was a card, too, with just 4 words. Happy birthday, Dad. Ethan. I stood in my kitchen holding that bottle, and for the first time in 3 years I cried. Not the angry tears I'd shed after our fight, but tears of hope. Maybe this was his way of saying sorry. Maybe we could find our way back to each other. Maybe Sarah was looking down and finally working her magic on her 2 stubborn men. But here's the thing about hope. Sometimes it makes you stupid. See, 2 years before our big fight, I'd had to stop drinking altogether. My cardiologist, Dr. Martinez, had been very clear about it after my second heart attack. Alcohol and my heart medication could kill me, he said. Not might kill me, would kill me. So I'd given up my evening whiskey, my beer with Sunday football, all of it. Standing there with Ethan's gift, I faced a dilemma. I wanted to honor his gesture, but I literally couldn't drink the whiskey without risking my life. That's when I thought of Robert. He'd always appreciated good whiskey, and he'd been so supportive during my recovery from the heart attacks. Plus, in some strange way, sharing Ethan's gift with Robert felt like bringing our fractured family back together, even if Ethan didn't know it. I called Robert immediately. Bob, I said, I've got something special I'd like to share with you. Can you come over? Robert arrived within the hour, and when I showed him the bottle and explained about Ethan's unexpected gesture, his face lit up with genuine joy. Frank, he said, this is wonderful news. Maybe it's the first step toward healing. We decided to save the whiskey for a special occasion, his daughter Lisa's promotion at work the following week. It would be a celebration of family in a way, a toast to new beginnings and second chances. That next Tuesday evening, Robert called me, excitement clear in his voice. Frank, Lisa just got the promotion. I'm going to open that beautiful bottle Ethan sent. Want to come over and share a toast? I almost said yes. God help me, I almost went over there that night. But I had a doctor's appointment early the next morning, and my arthritis was acting up something fierce. Rain check, Bob, I told him. But you go ahead and celebrate. You deserve it. 3 hours later, My phone rang. It was Lisa, and she was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. "Frank," she choked out, "Dad's in the hospital. Something's wrong, really, really wrong." I'd never driven so fast in my life. When I reached the hospital, I found Lisa in the emergency room waiting area. Her face pale as death. She fell into my arms when she saw me. "He was fine," she whispered. "We were celebrating. He had 2 glasses of the whiskey, and then he just collapsed. He started vomiting, couldn't breathe properly, and his skin turned this horrible color." Dr. Patterson, the emergency room physician, emerged from behind the curtain with a grim expression. "Mr. Dalton," he said, "your friend is in critical condition. We're running every test we can think of, but his symptoms are consistent with poisoning. Do you have any idea what he might have ingested?" The word poisoning hit me like a physical blow. "The whiskey," I stammered. "He was drinking whiskey that my son sent me for my birthday." I watched Dr. Patterson's expression change. "We need that bottle immediately." Lisa and I raced to Robert's house, where we found the bottle on his kitchen counter, about a quarter empty. The paramedics had left everything exactly as it was when they'd rushed Robert to the hospital. I carefully picked up the bottle, and that's when I noticed something I'd missed before. The seal around the cap looked different somehow, like it had been removed and reapplied. Back at the hospital, they rushed the remaining whiskey to the lab for analysis. While we waited, I sat by Robert's bedside watching this man who'd become like family to me fight for his life. His breathing was labored, his skin had a grayish tint, and the machines around him beeped ominously. "This is my fault," I whispered to Lisa. "If I hadn't given him that bottle." "Don't you dare blame yourself," she said fiercely. "You had no way of knowing, but I did feel responsible, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrible thought was forming. The timing of Ethan's gift after 3 years of silence, the way the seal looked tampered with, the fact that it was whiskey, something he knew I used to love but could no longer drink. Dr. Patterson returned 6 hours later with test results that confirmed my worst fears. "The whiskey was contaminated with white snake root," he said. "It's a plant that contains trematol, a highly toxic compound. The amount in that bottle was enough to kill a grown man." White snake root. I'd never heard of it, but Dr. Patterson explained that it was once called the milk sickness and had killed thousands of people in the early 1800s, including Abraham Lincoln's mother. It wasn't something you'd accidentally ingest. Someone had to deliberately add it to the whiskey. That's when Detective Sarah Williams entered our lives. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes but a steel backbone, and she asked questions that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Dalton," she said gently, "I need to ask you something difficult. Is there anyone who might want to harm you?" "Me?" I was confused. "Detective, Robert was the one who drank the whiskey. But you told the medical staff that the whiskey was a birthday gift meant for you, correct? Mr. Carson only drank it because you gave it to him." The full horror of what she was suggesting hit me like a freight train. Someone had tried to kill me, and through my own generosity I'd nearly killed my best friend instead. "The only person who knew I'd be drinking that whiskey," I said slowly, "was the person who sent it to me." Detective Williams nodded grimly. "I'm going to need your son's contact information." The next week was a blur of police interviews, search warrants, and sleepless nights. Robert remained in intensive care, his condition slowly improving, but still critical. I spent most of my time at the hospital, holding vigil and trying to process the unthinkable possibility that my own son had tried to murder me. The evidence, when it came to light, was overwhelming and heartbreaking. A search of Ethan's house revealed everything Detective Williams needed to build her case. In his garage, hidden behind old paint cans, they found mason jars filled with dried white snake root. In his home office, they discovered a notebook filled with research about the plant, its effects, its detection rates, and most damning of all, dosage calculations for what he called effective elimination. But the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that shattered my heart completely, was a text message thread between Ethan and someone whose number the police couldn't immediately trace. The messages, dating back 3 months, detailed a plan to take care of the old man and discussed the best way to administer the poison without detection. One message read, "White snake root in whiskey is perfect. Takes 1 to 7 days to work. Looks like natural causes. He won't suspect anything coming from his loving son." The response, "Are you sure about this? There's no going back." Ethan's reply, "He chose Robert over me. He destroyed our family. He deserves what's coming." When Detective Williams showed me those messages, I actually vomited, not from the shock, but from the sheer depth of hatred my son had harbored for so long. The person responding to his texts turned out to be Marcus, his old college roommate, who quickly turned state's evidence when confronted with the messages. But the worst discovery was yet to come. In that same notebook where Ethan had calculated dosages, the police found a page with my initials FD written at the top, followed by my weight, my age, and the words lethal dose underlined 3 times. Below that, almost like an afterthought, were Robert's initials with a question mark. My son had tried to kill me, not in a moment of rage, not in a fit of passion, but deliberately, methodically over the course of months. And when his plan went wrong, when Robert drank the poison instead of me, Ethan had said nothing. He'd let Robert suffer, let him fight for his life without a word of warning or confession. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't there to see it, but Lisa was. She told me later that Ethan had tried to run when the police arrived at his workplace. They caught him in the parking lot, and according to the news reports, he'd screamed that it wasn't supposed to happen this way, that Robert wasn't supposed to drink it. Not that Robert wasn't supposed to get hurt, that Robert wasn't supposed to drink it. Even in his moment of capture, Ethan was only sorry that his plan had failed, not that he'd nearly killed an innocent man. The media picked up the story, of course. "Local man poisons father's best friend in botched murder plot" was the headline that ran in our local paper. Suddenly, everyone in town knew that Frank Dalton's son had tried to murder him with poisoned whiskey. The looks of pity I got at the grocery store, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, it was almost unbearable. But nothing compared to the day I had to face Ethan in court. The trial began 4 months later. Robert had recovered, thank God, though he'd never be quite the same. The doctors said the white snake root had caused permanent damage to his nervous system, and he walked with a cane now, his hands sometimes shaking uncontrollably. I'd been dreading the moment I'd have to testify against my own son, but District Attorney Jennifer Walsh had been clear. My testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. I was the intended victim, the key witness, and the only person who could speak to Ethan's motive. The courtroom was packed the day I took the stand. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, but the only ones that mattered were Ethan's. When I finally looked at him, sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, I barely recognized the boy I'd raised. His hair had grown long and unkempt. His face was gaunt, and his eyes held an emptiness that chilled me to the bone. But what hurt the most was that when our eyes met, he didn't look away in shame or regret. He stared at me with something that looked almost like disappointment, as if I'd let him down by surviving. D.A. Walsh led me through my testimony methodically. The estrangement from Ethan, the arrival of the whiskey, my decision to share it with Robert, the poisoning, the investigation. Each answer felt like a nail in my son's coffin, and I was the one holding the hammer. Then came the cross-examination. Ethan's lawyer, a young public defender named Tom Bradley, did his best to paint a picture of a grieving young man driven to temporary insanity by the loss of his mother and the breakdown of his relationship with his father. "Mr. Dalton," Bradley asked, "isn't it true that you and your son had a difficult relationship after your wife's death?" "Yes," I admitted. "And isn't it true that you formed a close friendship with Robert Carson that your son felt excluded from?" "Ethan felt that way, yes." "So in your son's mind, you had replaced him with another man's father?" I wanted to explain, to make them understand that Robert had never replaced Ethan, that there was room in my heart for both of them. But the simple truth was harder to articulate. "Ethan chose to see it that way," Bradley pressed on. "Mr. Dalton, do you love your son?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I looked at Ethan sitting there in his orange jumpsuit, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to climb into my lap to read bedtime stories, the teenager who'd called me his hero after I taught him to drive, the young man who'd cried in my arms when his mother died. "Yes," I whispered, "I love my son." Even after everything that's happened? I was quiet for a long moment, aware that my answer might influence the jury's decision about my son's fate, but I couldn't lie. Not under oath. Not about something so fundamental. "Yes," I said finally. "Even now I love him, but love doesn't excuse what he did. It doesn't bring back the months Robert spent recovering, or erase the fear I live with every day, or repair the trust he shattered. I love my son, but I can't protect him from the consequences of trying to murder me. I saw something flicker in Ethan's eyes then, not remorse exactly, but maybe recognition that the father he'd tried to kill was still the father who loved him unconditionally. The prosecution's case was airtight. The physical evidence, the text messages, the research materials, expert testimony about white snake root, it all painted a picture of premeditated attempted murder. Ethan's defense team tried to argue temporary insanity and emotional disturbance, but the methodical planning made those defenses nearly impossible to sustain. The most damaging testimony came from Marcus, Ethan's old college friend, who'd been his confidant during the planning stages. Marcus testified that Ethan had talked about killing me for months, that he'd researched various methods before settling on white snake root because it was virtually undetectable and would look like natural causes. He said his father deserved to die alone, Marcus testified, his voice barely above a whisper. He said Frank had chosen Robert over his own son, and that was unforgivable. When it was Ethan's turn to testify in his own defense, I held my breath. Part of me hoped he would finally show some remorse, some recognition of the magnitude of what he'd done. Part of me hoped he'd apologize not just to me, but to Robert and Lisa, who'd been innocent victims of his rage. Instead, Ethan took the stand and blamed everyone but himself. He blamed me for abandoning him after his mother's death. He blamed Robert for stealing his father's affection. He blamed the grief counselor who'd suggested he find healthy ways to process his anger. He blamed Sarah for dying and leaving him alone with a father who didn't understand him. But most chillingly, he claimed that his only mistake was not ensuring I drank the whiskey myself. When D.A. Walsh asked him directly if he regretted trying to poison me, his answer was chilling in its honesty. I regret that Robert got hurt, he said, but my father made his choice. He chose Robert over me, and actions have consequences. Even his own lawyer looked stunned by that response. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the forewoman stood and delivered the words that would define the rest of my life. Guilty of attempted murder in the first degree. Ethan showed no emotion as the verdict was read. No surprise, no tears, no anger, just that same empty stare he'd worn throughout the trial. At sentencing, both Robert and I were given the opportunity to address the court. Robert spoke first, his voice still weak from the months of recovery. I don't hate Ethan, he said, gripping his cane with both hands, but I'll never understand how someone could plan another person's death with such coldness. The poison he put in that whiskey didn't just attack my body, it attacked my faith in human goodness. I hope he finds peace somehow, but I also hope justice is served. Then it was my turn. I'd written a speech, pages and pages, trying to articulate the complexity of loving someone who'd tried to kill you, but when I stood up and looked at my son, all those words seemed inadequate. Your Honor, I began, I lost my son twice. The first time was 3 years ago when we had our falling out. The second time was when I learned he'd tried to murder me. The man sitting at that table looks like my boy, but he's a stranger to me now. I don't know where the child I raised went, or when he was replaced by someone capable of such calculated cruelty. I can't ask for leniency, because Robert deserves justice. I can't ask for mercy, because Ethan has shown none. All I can ask is that someday, somehow the son I loved finds his way back to the light. But until that day comes, society needs to be protected from him. Judge Martinez sentenced Ethan to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As the bailiff led him away in shackles, Ethan looked back at me one last time. I thought maybe finally I'd see some flicker of the boy I'd raised. Instead, he mouthed 2 words that will haunt me until the day I die. Your fault. That was 2 years ago. Ethan is serving his sentence at the state penitentiary about 3 hours from here. I've received exactly 1 letter from him in all this time, and it contained only 4 sentences. I hope you're happy. You got what you wanted. You chose Robert over me, and now you'll never have to worry about me bothering you again. This is what you deserved. I've never responded to that letter, though I've written him a dozen responses I've never sent. What do you say to a child who tried to murder you? How do you explain unconditional love to someone who's only capable of conditional hatred? In the months following the trial, details continued to emerge that painted an even darker picture of my son's transformation. Detective Williams visited me one afternoon with additional evidence they'd uncovered during a more thorough search of Ethan's digital footprint. She sat in my living room, the same room where Ethan had played with toy cars as a child, and showed me printed emails dating back over a year. Mr. Dalton, she said gently, I debated whether to show you these, but I think you deserve to know the full scope of what we discovered. The emails were correspondence between Ethan and various online forums dedicated to what they called family justice. He'd been sharing our family's story for months, painting me as an abusive father who'd abandoned his grieving son for a replacement family. The responses he received were chilling, other angry individuals encouraging him to take action and make them pay. One thread, which Detective Williams highlighted with a yellow marker, showed Ethan asking for advice on untraceable methods to handle family problems permanently. The responses detailed everything from staged accidents to various poisons, with white snake root being suggested by someone with the username Nature's Blade. He wasn't acting alone, Detective Williams explained. We've traced several of these accounts to real people, and the FBI is investigating what appears to be a network of individuals encouraging each other to commit violent acts against family members they feel have wronged them. The revelation that my son had been part of some twisted online community of family hatred made everything even more surreal. It wasn't just grief or mental illness that had driven him to attempt murder. He'd found a group of like-minded individuals who'd validated and encouraged his darkest impulses. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when Detective Williams showed me Ethan's search history from the weeks leading up to my birthday. He'd researched not just how to poison someone, but how to act surprised and grieved when they died. He'd looked up how to cry on command and acting innocent during police questioning. He'd even researched funeral costs and inheritance laws in our state. My son hadn't just planned to kill me, he'd planned to play the devastated son at my funeral, collect whatever inheritance I might leave behind, and move on with his life as if nothing had happened. The media attention was relentless for months after the trial. Our local newspaper ran a series called The Poisoned Gift that detailed every aspect of the case. National crime shows picked up the story, and I found myself receiving calls from producers wanting me to appear on programs with titles like When Children Kill and Family Betrayal. I turned them all down, but that didn't stop them from running the story anyway. They interviewed our neighbors, former colleagues, even some of Sarah's old friends from her book club. Everyone had an opinion about where we'd gone wrong as parents, what signs we should have seen, how we could have prevented this tragedy. The worst part was watching them try to turn Sarah into a character in their narrative. One show suggested that her death had created a competition between Ethan and me for her memory. Another implied that she'd somehow enabled Ethan's eventual breakdown by being too protective. They took our private family grief and dissected it for entertainment, looking for simple explanations for something inexplicably complex. Mrs. Henderson, my next-door neighbor of 20 years, stopped speaking to me entirely. She told anyone who would listen that she'd always known something was off about that family. Suddenly, every argument Sarah and I had ever had, every time Ethan had seemed moody as a teenager, every family struggle that had once seemed normal became evidence that we were a dysfunctional family destined for tragedy. The hardest part was the well-meaning people who tried to comfort me with platitudes about how this wasn't my fault and how I couldn't have known. But the truth was more complicated than their reassurances. Had there been signs I'd missed? Had I failed my son in ways I was only now beginning to understand? I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Rebecca Santos, about 6 months after the trial. She specialized in families affected by violent crime, and she was the first person who didn't try to offer me easy answers or simple explanations. Guilt is a normal response, she told me during one of our early sessions. You're looking for ways this could have been prevented, because the alternative, accepting that your son made a conscious choice to try to kill you, is almost unbearable. During our sessions, I began to examine my relationship with Ethan more honestly. Yes, I'd been devastated by Sarah's death. Yes, I'd probably leaned too heavily on Robert's friendship during my grief. Yes, I'd perhaps been less emotionally available to my son during a time when he needed me most. But acknowledging those failures didn't mean I'd driven him to attempted murder. Dr. Santos helped me understand that plenty of families go through similar struggles without anyone trying to poison anyone else. Grief, conflict, and imperfect parenting might explain Ethan's anger, but they didn't excuse his choice to respond with calculated violence. The sessions also helped me process something I'd been avoiding, the signs I had missed, not of potential violence, but of the depth of Ethan's transformation into someone I no longer recognized. Looking back, I could see that the break between us hadn't been as sudden as I'd believed. For months before our final argument, Ethan had been making subtle comments about Robert that I dismissed as harmless jealousy. He'd questioned why I spent so much time with that man and suggested that Robert was taking advantage of my loneliness. I'd also noticed that Ethan had become increasingly critical of his mother's memory. He'd make comments about how she'd spoiled me or how I'd never appreciated her while she was alive. At the time, I'd attributed this to his grief, but now I wondered if he'd been rewriting our family history to justify his growing resentment. There had been other incidents too, times when Ethan had seemed almost pleased when I had health scares, moments when he'd made comments about how peaceful it would be when I was finally gone. I'd dismissed these as thoughtless remarks from a grieving young man, but they now seemed like glimpses into a much darker mindset. Dr. Santos helped me understand that recognizing these signs didn't mean I could have prevented what happened. Even if I'd understood the depth of Ethan's hatred, I never could have imagined he'd try to murder me. The leap from resentment to attempted homicide was so extreme that no reasonable parent would have anticipated it. Robert's recovery was slower and more complicated than any of us had initially hoped. The white snake root had caused neurological damage that affected not just his mobility, but his cognitive function. Some days he was sharp as ever, but other days he struggled to remember simple things or became confused about where he was. Lisa arranged for him to move into an assisted living facility about a year after the poisoning. It was a difficult decision, but his needs had become too complex for her to manage while working full-time and raising her children. I visited him there every Tuesday and Thursday, and we'd sit in the garden talking about everything except the reason he was there. One afternoon, about 18 months after the trial, Robert brought up Ethan without any prompting from me. "I've been thinking about that boy," he said, his words slightly slurred from the neurological damage. Not angry thoughts, mind you, just wondering what happened to him. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I remember when Lisa first brought him to meet me," Robert continued. "He was nervous about gaining a new father-in-law, worried I wouldn't approve of him. Sweet kid, really. Polite, considerate, clearly loved my daughter. What turns someone like that into—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. It was a question I'd been asking myself constantly. What had turned my sensitive, loving son into someone capable of methodical murder? Was it grief, mental illness, something genetic I'd passed down to him? Or had he simply made a series of choices that led him further and further from the light until he couldn't find his way back? Dr. Santos suggested that I might never have a satisfying answer to that question, and that seeking one might be keeping me trapped in the past. But I couldn't help myself. I needed to understand how the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms had become a man who wanted me dead. I started reading everything I could about family violence, about the psychology of murder, about how grief and mental illness can sometimes manifest in violent behavior. The more I learned, the more I realized how little any of it applied to Ethan's case. Most family violence is impulsive, driven by rage or desperation. Most people who kill family members do so in moments of passion, not after months of careful planning. Most children who harm their parents do so because of abuse, addiction, or severe mental illness, none of which applied to our situation. Ethan's case was unusual in its premeditation, its coldness, its complete lack of provocation that would make sense to any reasonable person. He hadn't killed me in a moment of anger or grief-fueled madness. He'd planned my death like a business transaction, researching methods, calculating dosages, and even preparing for the aftermath. The anniversary of my poisoning, because that's how I'd come to think of Robert's birthday celebration, the day I was supposed to die, became a marker I dreaded each year. The first anniversary fell on a Tuesday, and I spent the entire day in my house with the curtains drawn, unable to face the world. The second anniversary was different. Instead of hiding, I drove to the hospital where Robert had fought for his life and spent the morning in the chapel there. I'm not a particularly religious man, but something about that quiet space felt right for remembering not just what we'd survived, but what we'd lost. Because we had lost something, even beyond Robert's health and my relationship with my son. We'd lost our innocence, our faith in the basic goodness of family, our belief that love was always stronger than hate. That loss deserved to be grieved too. Lisa started a tradition on that second anniversary. She called it Gratitude Day. Instead of focusing on what Ethan had tried to take from us, she wanted us to celebrate what we still had. She brought her children over. We cooked Robert's favorite meal. He was having a good day and was able to join us, and we shared stories about the good times in our family history. It was during that dinner that Lisa said something that has stayed with me ever since. "Uncle Frank, I know what Ethan did was horrible, but I don't want to let his hatred erase all the love that came before it. You taught me how to ride a bike, how to change a tire, how to be brave when I was scared. Ethan can't take those memories away from us." She was right. For too long I'd been letting Ethan's final act define our entire relationship, forgetting the 28 years of love that had preceded his transformation. Yes, he'd tried to kill me, but he'd also been the little boy who'd made me a Father's Day breakfast in bed when he was 7, burning the toast but beaming with pride. He'd been the teenager who'd stayed up all night with me when our dog was dying, both of us crying together in the veterinary hospital waiting room. Those memories didn't excuse what he'd done, but they were still part of our story. They were still real, even if the person who'd made them no longer existed. I began to understand that grieving Ethan was like grieving Sarah in some ways. I was mourning someone who was gone forever, even though their body was still alive somewhere. The son I'd raised, the boy I'd loved, the young man I'd been so proud of, that person had died somewhere along the way, replaced by a stranger who wore his face but carried none of his heart. About a year and a half after the trial, I received an unexpected phone call from Tom Bradley, Ethan's former public defender. He'd left the public defender's office and now worked for a non-profit organization that provided legal services to indigent inmates. "Mr. Dalton," he said, "I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to let you know that Ethan has been asking about the possibility of appealing his conviction." My heart sank. "On what grounds?" "Ineffective assistance of counsel," Bradley replied. "He claims I didn't adequately represent him during the trial." The irony was bitter. Ethan wanted to appeal his conviction by claiming his lawyer hadn't done a good job defending him, the same lawyer who'd tried desperately to paint him as a grieving son, driven temporarily insane, rather than a calculating would-be murderer. "I wanted you to know," Bradley continued, "because if he files the appeal you might be contacted by investigators again. But honestly, Mr. Dalton, I don't think it has much chance of success. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and I did everything I could within ethical bounds to defend him." Bradley paused, then added something that surprised me. "I've been practicing criminal defense for 15 years, and I've never had a client who showed so little remorse for their actions. Even the most hardened criminals usually express some regret during sentencing. Ethan never did." After that phone call, I found myself wondering if Ethan's lack of remorse was a defense mechanism, or genuine indifference to the pain he'd caused. Was he so consumed by his own sense of victimhood that he couldn't see anyone else's suffering? Or was he simply incapable of empathy, broken in some fundamental way that made him dangerous to everyone around him? The appeal never materialized. According to Bradley, Ethan eventually dropped the idea, though not because he'd found any peace with his situation. He'd simply been told by multiple lawyers that his case was hopeless. 3 years after the trial, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to visit Ethan in prison. It wasn't because I'd forgiven him, or because I hoped for some tearful reconciliation. It was because I needed to see him one more time, to look into his eyes and try to understand who he'd become. I needed to know if there was any part of my son left in the man who'd tried to kill me. The visitation process was humiliating and exhausting. I had to submit to background checks, metal detectors, and invasive searches. I had to sit in a waiting room filled with other families dealing with their own tragedies, listening to crying children ask when Daddy was coming home. When they finally brought Ethan into the visiting room, I barely recognized him. Prison had changed him physically. He was thinner, his hair was shorter, and his skin had the pale, unhealthy color of someone who rarely saw sunlight. But it was his eyes that shocked me most. They were completely flat, devoid of any emotion I could recognize. We sat across from each other at a small metal table, neither of us speaking for the first few minutes. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, his voice emotionless. "I wasn't sure I would either," I replied honestly. "Are you here to gloat?" he asked. "To see how the mighty have fallen?" "I'm here because you're still my son," I said. "I wanted to see if you're okay." Ethan laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Okay. I'm in prison for 25 years because you turned everyone against me. How could I possibly be okay? Even then, even after everything, he was still playing the victim. I looked at this man who shared my DNA, who'd once been the most important person in my world, and felt nothing but sadness for how far he'd fallen. "Ethan," I said carefully, "do you understand what you did? Do you understand that you tried to murder me?" "I understand that you made your choice," he replied. "You chose Robert over your own flesh and blood. I was just responding to your choice." "You tried to poison me," I said, my voice rising slightly. "You researched lethal dosages. You planned my death for months. That's not a response to anything I did. That's attempted murder." For just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Maybe doubt, maybe recognition of the magnitude of what he'd done. But it passed quickly, replaced by that same flat indifference. "If you're looking for an apology," he said, "you're wasting your time. I'm not sorry for trying to make you pay for what you did to our family." I sat there looking at my son, this stranger wearing my son's face, and finally accepted what I'd been trying to deny for 3 years. The boy I'd raised was truly gone. This person across from me might share Ethan's memories and appearance, but he wasn't my child anymore. My child had died somewhere along the way, and I'd been grieving a ghost. "I love you," I told him as I stood to leave. "I'll always love the boy you used to be, but I can't save you from who you've chosen to become." Ethan didn't respond. He just stared at me with those empty eyes as the guard led him back to his cell. That visit gave me something I didn't expect: closure. Not the kind of closure that comes from reconciliation or forgiveness, but the closure that comes from finally accepting an unbearable truth. My son was gone, and he wasn't coming back. The man in that prison cell was someone else entirely, someone I didn't know and couldn't help. Driving home from the prison that day, I finally allowed myself to fully grieve the son I'd lost. I pulled over at a rest stop and cried for 20 minutes, not for the man who'd tried to kill me, but for the little boy who'd once trusted me to protect him from the monsters under his bed, never knowing that the worst monster would eventually live inside his own heart. Robert has recovered as much as he's going to. He still uses a cane, still has shaky hands on bad days, but his spirit has proven remarkably resilient. He's never once blamed me for what happened, though I know he thinks about it every time he struggles to write his name or has to use a handrail to climb stairs. Lisa visits me regularly now. She calls me her second father, and in many ways she's become the child I lost when Ethan chose hatred over healing. She brings her kids over, 2 beautiful grandchildren I'm blessed to know, though they'll grow up barely remembering their Uncle Ethan. I still live in the same house where Sarah and I raised our son. I've thought about moving, starting fresh somewhere new, but this house holds too many good memories to abandon because of one terrible chapter. Besides, running away won't change what happened or who my son became. Some nights I sit in my kitchen with a cup of tea and look at the spot where I first opened Ethan's deadly gift. I wonder what would have happened if I'd drunk that whiskey myself. Would I have suffered the way Robert did? Would I have died thinking my son had sent me a gesture of love, never knowing it was actually an instrument of murder? In a strange way, I'm grateful I gave the whiskey to Robert, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because it revealed the truth about what my son had become. If I'd died that night, Ethan might have played the grieving son at my funeral, fooling everyone including himself about what he'd done. People ask me if I hate Ethan now. The answer is complicated. I hate what he did. I hate the choices he made. I hate that he looked at Robert suffering in that hospital bed and felt nothing but disappointment that his plan had failed. But do I hate him? The man who tried to kill me? Sometimes. But I can't hate the little boy who used to make me Father's Day cards, or the teenager who cried when old Yella died. Maybe that's the curse of being a parent. You never stop loving your child, even when they become someone you can't recognize, someone you can't forgive, someone you can't trust. Love and disappointment can coexist in the same heart, along with grief for the person your child might have been if they'd made different choices. I've learned to live with the knowledge that my son is a stranger to me now. I've learned to find family in people like Robert and Lisa, who choose love over resentment, healing over revenge. I've learned that sometimes the people who share your blood can hurt you worse than any enemy ever could. But I've also learned that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding meaning in the aftermath, purpose in the pain, and hope in the most hopeless circumstances. Robert survived that poisoning and found a way to live with grace and dignity. I survived the betrayal and found a way to love the people who deserve it while grieving the one who chose darkness. The hardest lesson has been accepting that I can't save everyone, not even my own child. For years after Sarah died, I thought if I just loved Ethan enough, if I just tried hard enough, I could heal whatever was broken in him. But you can't love someone into being good, and you can't sacrifice yourself on the altar of another person's redemption, even if that person is your child. Ethan made his choices. He chose hatred over healing, revenge over reconciliation, murder over mercy. Those were his decisions, not mine, and I can't carry the weight of his sins along with my own grief. So where does that leave me now at 70 years old, with a son in prison and a heart full of contradictions? It leaves me here telling you this story, hoping that maybe someone listening needs to hear that they're not alone in loving someone who's become a stranger, in grieving someone who's still alive, in learning to protect themselves from people they'd die for. If you're listening to this and you recognize something in my story, if you have a child or a parent or a sibling who's chosen a dark path, please know that their choices don't define you. Their hatred doesn't negate your love. Their failures don't diminish your worth. And if you're listening to this and you're the person walking in darkness, please know it's not too late to turn toward the light. Ethan could write me a letter tomorrow, a real letter full of genuine remorse and accountability, and I'd drive 3 hours to see him. Love doesn't die just because trust is shattered. Forgiveness is possible, but only if the person seeking it is willing to truly face what they've done. I don't know if Ethan will ever find his way back to the man he could have been. I don't know if he'll serve his full sentence or find some measure of redemption behind those prison walls. I don't know if I'll ever hear him say the words "I'm sorry" and mean them. What I do know is that I survived something I never thought I could survive. I found family in unexpected places. I learned to live with an imperfect heart, both literally and figuratively, and discovered that broken doesn't always mean worthless. My name is Frank Dalton, and this is my story of betrayal, survival, and the complicated mathematics of love. It's not a pretty story, and it doesn't have a happy ending, but it's true, and sometimes truth is all we have to offer each other in this broken world. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel, because there are so many more stories that need to be told, so many people who need to know they're not alone in their pain. Sometimes, sharing our darkest moments is the only way to find light again. And to anyone out there struggling with family relationships that seem beyond repair, remember this. You are not responsible for other people's choices, but you are responsible for your own healing. Choose love when you can, choose boundaries when you must, and always choose to survive. That's my story. I hope it helps someone find their way through their own darkness. Thank you for listening, and please, take care of each other. We're all more fragile than we like to admit, and we're all more resilient than we know.